Hello guys, welcome to another video, and in this one I'm going to be doing a bit of a brief overview of my starter build for Dawn of the Hunt, which is going to be a Tactician build using a bunch of the new spear skills, and the main kind of idea of this build is Twister. So Twister is a new attack projectile skill that uses a spear, and how this skill works is you basically create a Twister that flies forward, it goes in the direction that you use the skill, and then it will hit enemies and pierce all enemies. And it will also bounce off of terrain and kind of go all over the place. It has quite a fast movement speed to begin with, but you can of course increase that with projectile speed. That's going to be one of the main scaling vectors there, is projectile speed. But the interesting thing about this skill is that it has quite a long base duration to begin with, so at 3 seconds this is quite a good amount of duration to be able to scale up. And the skill has a bunch of built-in damage scaling vectors, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So that's going to be the main ability of the build. Then we have some supporting abilities to kind of make the build work, beginning with Whirling Slash and Whirling Lance. So both of these skills create a whirlwind, which is a new mechanic that's coming into the game. And basically a whirlwind is like this kind of tornado looking thing on the ground, and it will stay there for a duration. And it has some of its own mechanics. For example, if you create a whirlwind and then move out of it, it will explode. But the part that we're interested in is how it interacts with Twister. So when a Twister encounters a whirlwind, it will actually consume the whirlwind to create an additional Twister and deal 80% more damage per whirlwind stage. So Whirling Slash, how it works is every time you use the skill while you stand in the whirlwind, it will increase the stage by 1 up to a maximum of 3. And this is basically the melee version of the skill to be able to create whirlwinds. There's also Whirlwind Lance, which is a ranged ability that also creates a whirlwind at the destination where the spear lands. And this one is kind of more important for our damage scaling, because the way this one works is that it can actually consume a frenzy charge to be able to create a whirlwind with not just maximum stages, but 1 extra stage on top. So this is going to create a 4-stage whirlwind when you consume a frenzy charge and the spear lands. And then if a Twister moves over that whirlwind, it will consume the stage 4 whirlwind, it will create an extra Twister, and those Twisters will deal 320% more damage, because each stage that gets consumed is 80% more damage. So that's one of the main scaling vectors there for boosting up the damage of Twister. But it also has another mechanic built into it to boost up the damage, which is how it interacts with elemental ground effects. So you can read right here, passing over elemental ground surfaces or consuming an elemental whirlwind will grant Twisters extra damage of that element. So whenever a Twister moves over a ground effect, either shocked ground, ignited ground, or chilled ground, it will take on that element and deal extra damage based on the element. So for example, if it moves over chilled ground, it will deal 50% of damage as extra cold damage for the remainder of its full duration. Now, combining those two mechanics together is an extra mechanic there so that you can actually just do them at the same time rather than doing one and then the other. So to do that, you can create a whirlwind on top of an elemental ground effect to create an elemental whirlwind, and then if the Twister hits an elemental whirlwind, it will take on both effects at once. So it will not only create an extra Twister and deal more damage based on how many stages the whirlwind was at, but it will also deal the extra damage based on the elemental type of the whirlwind that it consumed. So mainly I think in this build we're going to be using Twister and Whirlwind Lance, and as I said, the reason why we're using Whirlwind Lance specifically is because it has that extra mechanic there that allows you to consume a frenzy charge, and this build, as I'll explain in a moment, is going to be able to generate frenzy charges extremely easily all of the time. And we're going to need them because we need to consume frenzy charges for this skill, but we also need them for our other skill that we're using, Explosive Spear. This is how we're creating our elemental ground effect. So Explosive Spear is a skill that throws a spear at an enemy and then it basically detonates after a period of time. However, you can skip the whole detonation duration mechanic by consuming a frenzy charge. If you do that, it will explode immediately on contact, it will deal more damage, and more importantly, it will actually create ignited ground. So the base duration there is 4 seconds, but since we're scaling duration and we're also going to use some supports to boost this up as well, this will end up lasting in the region of 10 seconds, and it'll just be a huge ignited ground effect on the ground, and any whirlwinds that pass through that are going to gain extra fire damage. We're going to need a lot of frenzy charge generation, because every time we want to use Explosive Spear to create a ground effects, we're going to want to consume a frenzy charge for that. And we're also going to want to consume a lot of frenzy charges using Whirlwind Lance there to create those whirlwinds to then boost up the twisters that are passing through them and consuming them. So for that, we are playing Tactician. Tactician has access to a really strong branch here, which begins with suppressing fire. So projectile damage builds pin. So anytime we deal any projectile damage, this is mostly going to be from Twister, but it's also there from Whirlwind Lance or Explosive Spear. This will build up pin on the enemy, and pin is a mechanic where when an enemy is pinned, they cannot move. They also cannot be moved by knockback or anything like that. They're just stuck in place. Now, with that mechanic in play, we're going to make use of Combat Frenzy, which grants us a frenzy charge whenever we pin an enemy, as long as we haven't gained one from this mechanic within the duration of time. So we're going to have really good frenzy charge duration due to that. Now, going over back to the Tactician here, the next node we're going to take is right where we want them, which is pinned enemies cannot perform actions. Now, if pinned enemies can't move because of the base mechanics of pin, this part of the ability here makes it so that pinned literally makes enemies do nothing. They can't move, they can't use attacks, they can't use spells, they can't do anything. They just stand there while they're pinned, and they're not dangerous, they're not a threat, they can't do anything. And as far as I'm aware, this is going to work for bosses and things as well. So this is extremely strong. So that is going to be very strong defensively on this setup. And we're also going to be taking a solid plan, which is persistent buffs have 50% less reservation. And that is just really nice to be able to use a bunch of reservation skills to make this build feel really comfortable. So for example, like I said, we're going to be using Combat Frenzy, and instead of 30 Spirit, that's going to be 15. We're also going to make use of some persistent buff support gems, for example, Vitality, Clarity, and Precision. There's some new ones coming into the game as well this patch that make you have less elemental ailment duration on yourself. I believe it's 50% less, and those are 15 Spirit baseline reservation, so they'll only reserve 8 Spirit with this node. And we're also going to be using Ghost Dance there and Wind Dancer, because this build is going to be pathing up the right-hand side of the tree and is going to be mostly evasion and energy shield based. And even though Wind Dancer got nerfed this patch, at 15 Spirit cost, because this node is still a bargain skill to use. And so I've made a basic kind of setup here on Mobilitics, and as I say, this is very basic, it's very rough at the moment because we don't really know how leveling with a spear is going to feel. Some skills are going to feel better than others, but this is kind of the plan as we approach endgame, is to use this kind of setup of skills, but of course in the campaign it may feel a little bit different. So this is kind of a basic overview that I've made on Mobilitics. Right here, it gives you all of the information about the build, about how it works, about how the skills interact with each other. And if we scroll down here, we've got our skill gems here as well. These ones are currently missing from the loadout in Mobilitics. They'll be up soon. And I'll add those actually to the main loadout there after that. But for example, we've got Ghost Dance here. We're using Fast Forward on Ghost Dance, so it has less duration. That's because we're actually scaling the duration for our Twister, which is not good for Ghost Dance. So we want to kind of cut that duration down. And then, for example, we've got Frenzy there with Profusion, so that we have a chance to gain an additional Frenzy when we actually gain one from that. And we've got all of those persistent buffs there that reserve Spirit. These are all really cheap. For example, Clarity only reserves 5 Spirit for us because of the node on the Tactician. Precision is the same. Even Vitality at 10 Spirit is really good. And then we have the skills here, which is Whirling Slash. That's the melee version that creates a whirlwind. That's combined there with Rage and Font of Rage, so that we can get a little bit of Rage generation into the build. I don't actually expect to be able to get a lot of Rage from this, because the chances are you're going to be consuming the whirlwind very quickly whenever you do use it. But there is the potential there. For example, when you're in a boss encounter and there's a phase, you can stand in your whirlwind to gain Rage for a while. Or if you actually enter a boss room at the beginning and there's that kind of RP segment, you can stand there and gain Rage for a bit, and then you can continue to gain Rage in the fight every time this skill actually hits the enemy. And you're going to want to actually hit them anyway with this skill, because this actually deals melee damage, the Whirling Slash, and that's important for a new support gem on Twister that we're using. It's called Retreat, and it grants more projectile damage as long as you've dealt melee damage in the last 8 seconds. So that's going to be a kind of combo thing there that you want to make sure that you are using Whirling Slash. So Twister also has Martial Tempo for some more attack speed. It has Fire Infusion to give it extra fire damage, and that's because we're using a fire ground effect. Of course, Fire Infusion actually makes it deal less damage of the other elements, So we're using a fire ground effect deliberately there so that we don't actually counteract our ground effect there with the downside of fire infusion. And we're also using acceleration there for more projectile speed. Of course, if the Twister has a huge amount of duration and projectile speed, it's kind of bouncing all over the place like crazy. And it has a lot more chance, therefore, of actually hitting enemies again, because the skill can hit enemies multiple times, given it has enough duration and enough projectile speed. Then we have our Whirling Lance skill, which is the ranged version to create Whirlwind. That's linked to Magnified Effect, so that the Whirlwind is actually a bit bigger there, because sometimes you're going to be wanting to throw this right on top of the boss, and then of course you throw the Twister at the boss and it will actually hit the Whirlwind right on top of the boss and create an extra tornado, and those tornadoes will then actually be able to hit the target. And then we also have Perpetual Charge there, which is a support gem that potentially allows Whirling Lance to gain the benefits of consuming a frenzy charge without actually doing so. And then lastly, we have Explosive Spear there, which is our ground effect creator, and it's linked to Suffuse and Despoiler. So Despoiler is a support there which makes the ground effect last longer, and Suffuse is a new support gem that actually interacts with ground effects. It makes them have a larger duration over time. Now moving on to the passive tree here, we're basically starting off right here on the Mercenary start. We're grabbing a bunch of projectile damage, coming all the way down here. This wheel here is quite important. It has a lot of projectile speed there. As I said, projectile speed is an important scaling vector, as is skill effect duration. So both of these clusters here are really important. This one grants attack speed and skill effect duration, so that's really big. And then we've got some more projectile stuff here, and we're pathing through the Ranger start. And coming up here, we're grabbing this Pin and Run notable, which is really good on this setup in particular because it's a bit more pin build up, so we can pin things a bit faster. And then we have 5% increased movement speed if we've pinned an enemy recently, which in maps is going to be literally all the time. So this is basically just reading 5% increased movement speed while we're mapping, which is great. Then over here we're getting even more movement speed, and we're grabbing some energy shield nodes up here. For example, faster start of energy shield recharge. We're grabbing a bunch of energy shield stuff here in the middle and here, and coming up here for some skill speed. And then we're grabbing some attack damage here. Here's some more projectile speed scaling and a bit more movement speed and damage. And then coming through here, we've got some attack speed there, reduced cost of skills, more energy shield stuff. And then up here, we're grabbing some skill effect duration. As I said, that's a really important vector for scaling. This is a pretty basic setup of the tree. I'm not really sure if this is refined just yet, but what I'll do is I'll edit this setup on Mobalytics as and when I actually have more information on the build. But that is pretty much it. That's the setup that I'm going for. I think for my 4th Ascension, I'm likely to take Polish That Gear. There isn't really many other options, and I actually think Polish That Gear is really good. It's actually way better than I thought it would be, especially now after we got the patch notes, and we know that everyone that's playing in Path of Exile 2 is now going to have their elemental ailment threshold based on half of their health instead of all of it. And that means that monsters are going to be inflicting ailments on you a lot more commonly. And so Polish That Gear combined with evasion rating, which is what we're going for on this build, is going to be really nice to get a bunch of extra ailment threshold to kind of shore up that defense. But that's pretty much it, guys. I know it's a really basic overview. I can't really go too much into details about like leveling and things like that, because to be honest with you, I don't really have any idea what kind of spear skills are going to feel good in leveling. But this is what I'm going to be starting, a Twister Tactician build. Good luck with whatever you're starting in Dawn of the Hunt. I hope you have a fun League launch. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.